welcome to 55 minutes of current and relevant business conversations. That's what we do on Business Morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ini John McQuarrie. Let's do business. We'll begin from the global space where oil prices ticked up in early trade after ending the previous session up more than 4% on worries that the Iran-Israel conflict could disrupt supplies. So we see the numbers. It's a green one for Brent, 19 cents, and that's about a quarter of a percentage, or more than 1%, beg your pardon, up there to $77.58 a barrel. WTI is also up almost 1.5%. $76.25 a barrel. And so, of course, we know that the issue around Israel and Iran is still top on the list. And then yesterday we saw that the Fed, the U.S. Fed, they held rates again to the displeasure of President Donald Trump. And we'll get more about his reaction later on during Global News with Ladi Williams. But for this morning, let's speak to Mr. Bismarck Rewane and see how this affects us, or may affect us, back here in the emerging economies, especially here in Africa. Mr. Rewane, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Ini, and thank you for having me this morning.
So I guess it was predictable that the key rates will be held for the fourth consecutive time, to the displeasure of President Donald Trump. But, I mean, how does this go down, the consequences to us here in Nigeria and Africa as a whole?
No, actually, it was expected. As a matter of fact, the more the pressure that Trump put on power, the more likely that there will be no cut, and it held steady. But what was more important than anything else is the fact that the Federal Reserve is now predicting that there will be a slowdown in a growth rate in the United States later this quarter. So, one, there will be a slowdown in growth. Two, they're maintaining interest rates. And three, the question of having two cuts this year is now becoming more unlikely. So we might have one cut this year, and that's good enough. But I think we have to go back to the meeting of this morning at the Bank of England, where rates are expected to be held at 4.25% per annum. But really, what has happened is that there's a disconnection between the global shocks and the threats of Iran and Israel and all of that, and the global financial markets. So really speaking, we should expect those rates to be held where we expected it to go down. And therefore, for Nigeria in particular, who is going to approach the international credit markets this year to raise some additional money, it means that rates are not going to be as low as we expected. Therefore, external debt service burden on Nigeria is going to be much higher than was earlier anticipated. Having said that, the fact that certain parameters, the Nigerian economic parameters, are more stable than they were earlier in the year, means that it may not be so much of a threat. That notwithstanding, at $77 a barrel, this is higher than our benchmark price. This is far higher than we're expecting. That we're obviously we thought that the price of oil would drop to about $60 a barrel, but holding at 77 at this time, it means something. There is a decoupling between what the oil markets are saying and what the tension in the Middle East is actually reflecting.
Yeah. So we see, of course, on the one hand, the price of oil surging, and we've talked about the pros and cons of that. Now, you also brought in the issue of the borrowing. And it does seem like the government is being intentional about that borrowing. So we saw that they launched the green bond. That, of course, is another borrowing. But since that's domestic, it might be cheaper for the government. Do we see the government maybe cutting down on those foreign borrowing that might bring in the elements of dollar?
Not at all. I think we shouldn't confuse international borrowing from domestic borrowing. The Sukuk bonds and all those things are domestic borrowing. We have not maxed out on our borrowing requirements, but the most important thing for, as far as we are concerned, is that what are you borrowing to do? One, we are increasing our revenues because the tax law, the tax act is going to be signed by the president, according to Wale Edun, in the next 2 weeks. If that is done, we will see a growth, an increase in our revenue. But the important thing here is that Nigeria needs some dollars. And those dollars are either going to come from investments that are coming in voluntarily or from borrowings that are done strategically. So I'm saying that if we were anticipating to borrow, because we thought interest rates are going to come down. Therefore, the debt burden, service burden will not be as hard as it was originally expected. Now, the drop in interest rates is going to be delayed a little bit longer towards the end of the year or early next year, which means that Nigeria will have to raise money at a higher rate than was originally anticipated. And that being the case, we now have to be more efficient in the way we use our money. What are we borrowing for? What are the projects? Are those projects going to generate enough revenue to amortize and service that debt? Those are the key elements. And it is important because we have done about 740 days since the administration came into power, and the time is running out. So we need to be very, very intentional, very strategic, and focused on what we are borrowing for, so that the impact, one, to generate revenue, two, to have an impact on the welfare of the people, so that the people can see the impact, begin to reap the dividends of reform and policies and democracy.
So, Mr. Rewane, it does seem when it comes to borrowing, perhaps I might be wrong, the government is doing more or maybe talking more about the domestic borrowing, especially like the Sukuk and the Green Bond, which are tied to projects. And it seems that is helping them to win the mind of more Nigerians, you know, when it comes to the issue of debts and what the funds are being used for.
Yeah, you see, the reality is that let's not be allergic to borrowing. What we should be allergic to is we should be allergic towards leakages and, you know, what, in other words, the monies that are being, you know, corruption and lack of transparency. If you borrow and say you borrow to build a refinery, and the refinery is producing, and because of the production and consistency in the refining, you are getting steady supply, productivity increases, the economy as a whole is benefiting. It is not, it is, in fact, it is uneconomic and, you know, and it is not professional for a company or a country not to borrow at all. Because your credit worthiness is high, you'll be borrowing at rates much lower than the rate of inflation. And that's what's happening. So what we should be looking out for in the next quarter is if the Central Bank of Nigeria, because inflation is beginning to moderate and it has come down 2 months consistently now, consecutively, if the rates are coming down, then the rates at which the federal government of Nigeria is going to be borrowing, and the state governments for that matter, is going to be lower. And in that case, what are they going to use the money for? To pay off debt so that the contractors can then mobilize and get workers to the field. And that will actually increase productivity and output. And that is the key. Inflation has two variables that drive it. One is low output because of constraints, and two, excess liquidity. So the central bank is going to be making sure that liquidity is constrained, and on the other hand, the infrastructure bit is ensuring that productivity and output is increasing. Then you will have some moderation in inflation and an increase in growth. That is what Nigeria will be looking at. But then, even when you are completely good, the question is, does it go round? Is it increasing income inequality between the haves and the have-nots, which is a major problem that we are facing? And I think all hands are on deck. All hands should be on deck to ensure that the income inequality and opportunity inequality is narrowed, so everybody gets to enjoy the benefits. I want to use that word again, over-labored word, the dividends of reform.
So putting all of these factors together, what way or what decision do you think our MPC could take when they meet next month?
Okay, let me say one. We think, and we saw inflation decline in April, decline in May. We think that in June we may not be so lucky. Why do we say that? Because the Mokwa flood effect, one. Two, there has been the rains and the planting season. We've seen that the exchange rate has stabilized. As a matter of fact, I appreciated in the power market, the Naira is trading below 1,600. But the lag between when the things that are moderating inflation begin to kick in and when we feel the effect, and the other things that have increased the price level, one, diesel price is above 1,000 again. We see some of the commodities, and when you go to the commodities, you see that they had all increased, but they are now flatlining. They're not going higher because we've seen that consumers are beginning to resist and begin to not buy anymore. But if you take the commodities in particular, say rice is now 82,000. It used to be as high as 105 last year. At 82,000, that's kind of stable. Tomatoes are up at 90,000, and that's flat, and that is much higher than it used to be. Pepper is at 185,000 naira, which is significant, and even onions is way up at 130,000. Palm oil is at 12,000. So, yes, the prices are flatlining in towards the end of June, but compared to May, those prices are much higher, and therefore, if that is the case, the question before the central bank and the NPC is that, one, we saw inflation decline in April, we saw inflation decline in May, now we've seen a marginal increase in prices. Should we wait and see and hold, maintain status quo, or should we be aggressive and bring interest rates down, which means that we might begin to see pressure. But as a betting man, I would say there's a 60% possibility or probability that the central bank will hold, and there's a 40% probability that the central bank will reduce interest rates by a maximum of 25 basis points, just to show that we want to get growth going again. But the big question is that between now and July 20th, if the GDP numbers come out for Q1 and they are stronger than expected, then one would say that the MPC is likely to bring down interest rates. But don't get excited, don't get carried away. Even if they're going to bring down interest rates, it will not be more than 25 basis points, which is a cautious way of doing things. Central banks are supposed to be very cautious and intentionally where they go doing things. You can see what has happened at the Federal Reserve yesterday. You can see what's going to happen at the Bank of England today. There's no difference. Nigeria's central bank is not going to do anything different and behave anyway. Will not be an outlier. They'll be doing things very rationally, very cautiously, and extremely, taking all factors into consideration. So that's what I expect.
Yeah, cautious. But Mr. Rewane, the killings that we've had, mostly in areas that are supposed to be the source of food or food items at least, are those factors that may also feed into this decision or the numbers that we could see, both for inflation and for the GDP?
No, but you see, we talked about food inflation, right? The GDP is for Q1. That is because Q2 is ending at the end of this month. So what we are saying is that if GDP in Q1, which normally is always a slow quarter, if the GDP is at 3.46, which is what the consensus opinion is, that means that it's going to be higher than the traditional level, which last year was much lower than that. So the base effect is there. The fact that productivity is beginning to increase compared to the trend, even though not as high as we want it to be, means that the central bank could be encouraged to bring down interest rates a little bit so that it can spur growth, while the mandate of the central bank is not growth driving, but it's also about price stability. The central bank will focus more on inflation, but at the same time will give an impetus to the fiscal authorities to say, okay, we have brought down interest rates to encourage people to invest. But then the fiscal authorities have to do a lot of things about the bottlenecks on productivity, the roads, the concessioning of the roads, which has been delayed for some time. We have to address that so that contractors can get to the site and begin to employ people and begin to produce and begin to reduce the constraints for logistics. I think those are the key things. So let's separate the issues. Central bank will focus on monetary policy, monetary stability, and also to bring prices down, while the fiscal authorities will focus on how to get output higher and how to reduce the cost of logistics and cost of production. Please bear in mind the fact that we saw in the last inflation report, we saw inflation in Borno State, food inflation in Borno State higher than 36%, while in Katsina State, on the other, we saw food inflation at about 6%. The difference between what's happening in Northeast and Northwest is night and day. And that is not natural. So the question we're going to ask is, how much of this inflation is structural, which means that it is much more fundamental, and how much of it is transient because of events that are happening, like the crisis in Benue State, the floods in Mokwa, and also the insecurity. We have seen that there's a strong correlation between insecurity and food inflation, and strong correlation between food inflation and cost of living crisis. So all of these things have to be looked at holistically rather than individually.
All right, I'm talking about food inflation. Mr. Rewane is still planting season, I guess. So commodities, domestic commodities now, I guess they're still on the climbing side.
Yes, no, we've seen domestic commodity prices. They increased last month. One, because of the price of diesel. Two, because the exchange rate actually depreciated a little bit last month, but it's now appreciating again. We also saw that the some of the insecurity has led to that. Now, if the battle against insecurity is more than just sound bites, because what has happened in the last 6 months has been more sound bites. Every day we talk about arresting herdsmen or whoever the culprits are, but nothing happens. So now people have factored in this uncertainty and this insecurity into the pricing of goods, and it's going to have a negative impact on inflation. So let us assume that now the security forces are going to be serious about dealing with insecurity. Once you deal with that, once you can actually begin to contain and curtail insecurity, and at the same time allow the roads for goods to move from one part of the country to the other, you will see that food inflation begins to decline. If you can get that done, then all other things begin to happen. But it's what talk is cheap. I can say what I like here, but when it comes to taking care and actually solving the insecurity problem, it's much more structural and fundamental than we think. But there's a lot of work to be done. So luckily, with the tax incentives coming up, companies beginning to invest more because there's some stability in the exchange rate, we might begin to see increase in output, irrespective of what the security situation says.
All right, Mr. Rewane, thank you so much for taking us through all of that, the inflation and what to expect from the NNPC.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Now, the Senate Committee on Public Accounts, chaired by Senator Aliyu Wadada, has raised serious alarm over discrepancies involving trillions of naira in the audited financial statement of the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited, describing the revelations as mind-boggling and worrisome. During the investigation session where the Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Dapo Shegun, appeared before the committee, the absence of detailed records justifying massive legal and auditing fees was flagged, as well as contradictions in receivables reportedly worth over 210 trillion naira between 2017 and 2023. Senator Wadada further states that of most concern are the receivables. The committee underscored that the concerns stem directly from the analysis of NNPCL's audited financial statements spanning from 2017 to 2023, not from speculation. The committee has now handed over a list of 11 queries to NNPCL's finance team and has given them 1 week to return with answers.
Crude expenses figure was and is still, since that is what is contained in the statement, 103 trillion naira. And what make up accrued expenses are: 1, retention fees, legal fees, and auditors' fees. Just this afternoon, before the commencement of the exercise, NNPC brought a new document, a document to the committee that is completely independent of what is contained in the audited financial statement and with items that contradict the items contained in the audited financial statement. This is found very ridiculous, very unacceptable by the committee, but be it as it may, you have listened to all that transpired, and the questions are now handed over to them. It is important for the public to know each of these questions emanated as a result of what we discovered from the audited financial statement of NNPC from 2017 to 2023. Accrued expenses and then receivables, we are talking over 210 trillion naira. For us, as representatives of the people, we will do the best we can. I know for a fact that this will not just go down the drain.
A worrying one there, one must say. Well, the federal government, states and local councils have shared 1.659 trillion naira as May 2025 revenue, and this is according to the June FAAC meeting. The federal government got 538 billion, states 578 billion, and local councils got 420 billion, with 124 set aside for oil-producing states as 13% derivative. Well, gross revenue hit 2.94 trillion with boosts from VAT, company income tax, and import duty. However, revenue from petroleum taxes, levies, and royalties fell. President Bola Tinubu will assent to the recently passed tax bill over the next 2 weeks. That's coming from the Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Mr. Wale Edun. Mr. Edun made the remark at a policy lecture organized by the Presidential Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms Committee in Abuja. The minister explains that the tax bills will bring to the nation's system fairness, clarity, and ease of tax administration with a view to the provision of better services for Nigerians.
This policy lecture is bringing together government officials, finance experts, members of the academia, and development partners to reflect on the federal government's policies and how to make it work better. The event is part of activities to celebrate the 50th birthday of the chairman of the Presidential Committee on Fiscal and Tax Reforms, Mr. Taiwo Oyedele, who delivered the keynote address. First, he notes the need for tax reform.
Simplifying and rationalizing taxes so there are not too many. Addressing distortions created by the various incentive regime that we have and lack of clarity, and providing a level playing field.
He then lists some of the benefits of overhauling the nation's tax base, as well as other critical reforms to improve the livelihood of Nigerians.
We must address regulatory overreach, embrace digitalization, particularly in government services, refine our tariff system to reduce the rates on raw materials and intermediate products, which currently are twice the average for sub-Saharan Africa.
Please welcome him to the panel.
Next is a plenary session. Speakers bear their minds on the federal government's policies and the need for better coordination.
I'm an advocate for being bold and being strategic. So the strategic aspect of being bold is the fact that is where you have a synergy that would enable you mitigate the pushback you get within a bold and visionary idea.
The International Monetary Fund believes the need for more revenue collection is long overdue.
If there is something you have to remember from the IMF position, is to raise revenue and spend on Nigerians. So any fiscal effort that is being done has to come back very quickly into spending on those productive sectors.
The Minister of Finance agrees with the IMF and announces the plan by the President to assent to the bill.
And that's why we have today success in terms of a proposal for proposed bills that are now ready for Mr. President to sign into law. And what will they give? They will give greater fairness. They will give clarity. They will give ease of administration, best practice around the world. And ultimately, and not least of all, they will give more revenue for government.
Globally, accelerated revenue generation and improved policies remain critical to national development, and the federal government plans to leverage on this. Sarah Chimugu, Channels Television News.
Nigeria's food security issue is no longer news, and it's even worsened with the level of insecurity, seeing the killings that have taken place in states that are supposed to be the core producers of food in the country. So how now can we expand the team of food producers in Nigeria? Let's have this conversation with the Associate Professor at Michael Okpara University of Agriculture in Umudike, Dr. Philip Ntor. Dr. Ntor, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning, Ini.
Well, you know, having this conversation alone, Dr. Ntor, is a challenge, because we're talking of attracting the youth into the agriculture space, and we're seeing farmers being killed. So, I mean, I don't know what picture that even presents to the youth that we're trying to attract to the agriculture space.
Yeah, it's quite unfortunate that a country that is blessed with enormous agricultural potentials, like about 70 million hectares of land, very conducive for agriculture, where you have two seasonal periods, rainy season and dry season, which is also very good for agriculture. And then you have abundant water resources, both underground and surface. And yet, the country is still complaining of food insecurity. And we have large market size, given our population of over 200 million, which means we don't have to complain about food. We have everything, what it takes. We have a very youthful population that ought to engage in agriculture. But the problem, I should think, is that we still engage in a primitive type of farming. We still engage in crude implements where young people are expected to use knife, to use hoe. There is no all over the world, developed countries, the countries we want to imitate, they no longer use knife, they don't use hoe. Even with the mechanization, the so-called mechanization that we are preaching, the world is even leaving us behind. They're no longer talking about mechanization, but precision farming, where drone is used, where sensor remoting is used, where agriculture have gone high-tech. They are no longer talking about even mechanized that we have not even entered. We are still asking the youth, even in the universities, the students are still encouraged to use knife, to use hoe, to use shovel, to do agriculture. It ought to be a thing of the past. We're supposed to go beyond mechanized to talk about high-tech, like use of drone that I mentioned. So that is the problem. And it's compounded by the insecurity that you have in the Benue and other states that ought to be our food basket. So something ought to be done to expand the scope, to expand the number of people that will engage in agriculture, especially down in the areas where you have security. Like where you have security, like down south, people ought to go into farming. Youth ought to encourage to go into mechanized agriculture. But when everybody wants to do prestigious job. Everyone want to wear tie to go to work, wear clean T-shirt and clean jeans to go to farm. You don't expect somebody who use hand and start to till the soil, will use knife and start to clear the bush. Nobody will expect the son or daughter to go into that type of business. You expect your son to go into something if we can't achieve precision farming, where you use the drone, where you use the remote sensor, where you use other high-tech. At least the minimum we should talk about is mechanized farming, where you can use tractor, where you can use plow, where you can use harrowing and other kind of machines. At least we should reduce the number of manual labor that engage in agriculture. So the problem we have why youths are not engaging is that much attention is not given to mechanized agriculture, precision type of agriculture. We still ask them, like in our university and all the universities, not even our own alone, all the universities, you still see during their practical period, they still ask them to use a knife, to use hoe. I remember many years ago when we did our own practicals, we were trained how to use tractor. But now go to most of these university teaching farms, no tractor, no single functional tractor.
So Dr. Onto, shouldn't we say, I mean, you are in the academics, shouldn't we come back to you? You are training these young people, and it is the training that they get from school that paints the picture of the reality of what's ahead of them. So shouldn't we come back to, people like you and your school to get more equipment so that we can attract more of them into the food production space?
That is what it ought to be, but problem is still remain funding. University, though university can sustain the amount of, can raise the kind of money that is required to go into mechanized or precision agriculture. No university can do it. You know the cost of equipment, you know the cost of drone, you know the cost of all these high tech that are required now. If you travel to good universities, like I did my postgraduate program in Technion Institute of Technology in Israel, government sponsor all these things, where the youth ought to train. What the university can still afford all over the country is only knife and hoe and shovel. Most of them cannot get tractors. That is required. So the problem with many universities is funding. If funding is there, I know that they will raise the technology that is required. If you go to our agricultural engineering department, they have done research on how to improve the technology, but where is the funding? So I think the major problem in this aspect is funding.
So what should we do about this, Dr. Onto? Where should we go to? What should we start doing to solve this funding issue?
The funding issue, I have a lot of ideas that I have raised in different platforms, where a situation where that you can ask banks. You see most of these banks, every year they declare more than 1 trillion profit. Many companies, they declare more than 1 trillion companies, all these communication companies. I think the best approach is that let percentage of this, their profit, they declare. Let it be devoted to establish agency that will be charged with the responsibility of establishing small and medium scale agriculture, establishing, assisting universities to fund training of our young people. Without funding, no university can cope with the reality of the moment. No university can do that. So we need funding. All the universities in the country, visit their teaching or demonstration farms, visit their livestock farms, like poultry. You go, virtually all the poultries are empty. You go to their arable crop farms, nothing is happening there. Where you still see students, they use the hoe, they use the knife. Nobody will expect the son or the daughter to engage in such type of agriculture. So funding is required. If university can do what it ought to do to engage more youth into agriculture, even after graduation, assuming even with the kind of training we give them, when they graduate, will you expect them to also go into that crude method of farming? You expect them to use go into mechanized system of farming. That is what is expected. But nobody will be expected after graduation. Then you go and get. Another problem is, even when you graduate, do they have access to credit? Do they have access to finance? Do they have access to land? Do they have access to improve varieties of agricultural inputs? So those are the problems that government ought to formulate policies on how they can handle. Without that, university cannot do much. Without that, even our youth will not want to engage in agriculture. So it requires government and other private sector collaborating with the universities. It's only through that you can now see that more youth will be engaged.
So, you know, talking about collaboration, it would really be nice, because a lot of times we say how there are great ideas in the universities and in the academics, but connecting them to the implementation and the reality is another thing. So, you know, it would be really nice if we could have universities like yours focus on agriculture, for instance, working directly with the Ministry of Agriculture in your state, even if it's not the national one. I think that could bring a lot of progress and, you know, solve some of these challenges.
Most of even the state governments, when you also talk about funding, like I'm the director in charge of Agribusiness Incubation Center, I've written proposals to many state governments within the catchment area, written to so many public sector individuals, written to so many people, but none is showing interest because they think that agriculture does not give quick returns. And as far as I know, agriculture has the highest return on investment. Once all the things that are required are involved, it gives higher returns. But the problem is that no people don't show interest because they feel that the gestation period is so long. So nobody will want to support. We have written proposals to even the state government. They also complain of funding. What is happening in the state ministries? Assuming the state ministries are functioning well, we can also, our youths can collaborate with them and then move into the communities to teach even the rural communities, the rural farmers, on how to engage, include this modern method of farming. But the problem is that funding is the major problem. Until the funding problem is handled, I think we'll still continue to talk about food insecurity. There must be a funding breakthrough before anything reasonable can happen.
What about the issue of you know, research, quality of seedlings? Those are they not major factors in agricultural space?
Obviously, there are a lot of research going on. There are good real-world experiments conducted on agriculture. But the problem is that if you conduct the research and get a good result, how will you commercialize it? Because except when you get the report, you find out that it will only end in the university library, end in their archive, where the professor or the lecturer will only use it for promotion. So there is a disconnect between our industry, between our public sector and the research centers. Go to our university, you see a lot of researches conducted with good recommendations. But who are coming to look for the recommendations? Who are tapping from the recommendations made by university professors, made by the research centers? The answer will be nobody. Nobody is interested. So I think our problem is that there is a serious disconnect between our research centers and the people that ought to use product of research.
And you've said that, I mean, even in the area of funding, you've reached out to government agencies, maybe like the one in your state, and there hasn't been positive response. So I wonder what else we can do. I guess the last hope is the media now. We just have to keep having these kind of conversations to see if we would be able to break through to, especially the government or even the private sector, you know, to try to get some response and progress.
If you recall, around 1976, there was something that was called the Agricultural Credit Guarantee Loan Scheme, something like that, where a particular percentage of bank profit was devoted into agriculture. You also see some companies were taxed and the money devoted to agriculture. You see even in the third fund, which is the major funding agency for universities, no intervention line is meant for agriculture. You have intervention line for library. You have intervention line for ICT. You have intervention line for building of houses and the rest of them. I think that let a particular percentage of money that is going to third fund be devoted to agriculture so that every year each university of agriculture will get a particular percentage that will be used for research, used for commercialization of the product of research. And outside that, I think that our students should have a serious, to connect with the NEP fund, where scholarship will be given to, full scholarship will be given to those that are studying agriculture. You see that many people have lost interest in studying agriculture because of this crude and primitive method of farming. So many don't have interest. So to bring back the interest, one thing government to do, make the areas tuition free, give those studying it bursary. Once they graduate, set up a fund, like I said, agency for establishment of small and medium scale agriculture, where if you study and write good proposal, you'll be given a grant. Just like during Okonjo-Iweala's period, there was a UWIN. That UWIN assisted so many people to set up agricultural businesses. You move into rural areas, those that wrote good proposal. I know that some of my students, people I supervised, got that UWIN, 10 million. And most of them are doing very well. And I don't know what happened to the fund, whether it's still there. But if assuming it's no longer there, government can set up a similar scheme where if you graduate, write a good proposal, then fund will be given to you. And there will be an agency that will supervise it regularly to see how far you are doing. And if you are not, if you have funding, have any difficulty in coping, then they will bring in experts that will guide you. That is the only way we can come out of this our mess. Or that we'll continue to import food from China, import food from Netherlands and other countries. All the countries that made it also started this way. But they didn't joke with their research. They didn't joke with their university, agricultural universities and research centers.
All right, Dr. Philip Nto. Well, so many policies already even in existence at this time for credit for agriculture and all, but I guess it's the carrying out of the credit of the policies. That's another issue. But thank you so much for your time and sharing your suggestion with us this morning. Dr. Philip Nto is Associate Professor at Michael Okpara University of Agriculture in Umudike. All right, now let's head to the global space now. And of course, top on the news is the Federal Reserve. Yep. Laddie, you didn't even wait for me to call you in. You and Jerome Paul are friends, but President Trump is very angry with both of you.
He's not having it. You know, President Trump is not having it. He wants his cut, you know, at this point. He believes it's time, you know, for the U.S. to have its first cut and even multiple cuts, you know, going into 2025. But, you know, from what was said so far yesterday, maybe just about 2 cuts left, max, you know, in 2025. So they have it. The Federal Reserve held their key interest rate at 4.25 at about 4.50% for the 4th straight meeting yesterday, projecting a slowdown in growth and a spike in inflation amid tariff-driven uncertainty, you know, signaling a flirtation with a stagflation scenario. Despite this caution, policymakers still anticipate 2 rate cuts by year-end, forecasting a median policy rate of 3.9% in 2025. However, next year's outlook is darkened with projections now pointing to a slower pace of cuts, about 3.6% in 2026, up from 3.4% and 3.4% in 2027. Let's have a listen to the Fed chairman there, Jerome Powell. Take a listen.
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. Despite elevated uncertainty, the economy is in a solid position. The unemployment rate remains low, and the labor market is at or near maximum employment. Inflation has come down a great deal, but has been running somewhat above our 2% longer run objective. In support of our goals, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged. We believe that the current stance of monetary policy leaves us well positioned to respond in a timely way to potential economic developments. I'll have more to say about monetary policy after briefly reviewing economic developments. Following growth of 2.5% last year, GDP was reported to have edged down in the first quarter, reflecting swings in net exports that were driven by businesses bringing in imports ahead of potential tariffs. This unusual swing has complicated GDP measurement. private domestic final purchases, or PDFP, as we call them, which excludes net exports, inventory investment, and government spending, grew at a solid 2.5% rate. Within PDFP, growth of consumer spending moderated, while investment in equipment and intangibles rebounded from weakness in the fourth quarter. Surveys of households and businesses, however, report a decline in sentiment over recent months and elevated uncertainty about the economic outlook, largely reflecting trade policy concerns.
That was Fed Chair there, Jerome Powell. Given the latest decision, another uphold at this point, and we did get reaction. President Trump, again, assailed the Fed Chair there, branding him the worst, and, you know, some harsh words there coming from the president towards the Fed Chair just hours after the Reserve opted to hold interest rates steady for the fourth consecutive meeting and declined to commit to future easing. So Trump's harsh post shared on Truth Social was linked to an article highlighting Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae regulator bill as a political suggestion that Powell should resign if he doesn't cut rates. So that was a reaction right there. But let's get a check on how other markets and other economies reacted. Juliana joins us now. Great to have you, Juliana. Good morning. So what's the reaction to the latest decision by the U.S. Fed in the U.K., or do investors there, maybe they don't really care?
Good morning, Laddie. It's quite interesting, actually, listening to Powell. Thank you for playing his clip, because, to be fair, I don't think this is making as big a statement as it would have a couple of days ago. Why? And that's because we're, I think, in the 6th day of the Iran-Israel conflict, and I think all markets are very much focused on what US President Donald Trump is going to do, because, as we know, this is going to have huge global ramifications on the world order, including policy and including trade. So I think that was why Jerome Powell, the US Fed chair, was so easily able to laugh off Trump's remarks, calling him stupid, which, again, in any normal world would be absolutely unacceptable. But we're living in Trump's world, right? And he can criticize his central bank governor like that. But look, you know, there are many uncertainties at the moment. And I think one thing that is certain, particularly from a US stance, is that Jerome Powell is not a man to be moved. You know, he downgraded American growth this year. I think he kind of uplifted inflation. He thinks inflation is still going to be elevated. And he spoke about the key topic of the US economy at the moment, which is tariffs. I think it's very easy for the Trump administration to play up just how brutal these tariffs are going to be on some of their counterparts across the world. But how is this going to affect the US consumer, right? And I think that was what was so important and key about what Powell said yesterday. I think broadly it's good. You know, the jobs are up. I think they added a couple of 100,000 jobs last month, according to the data that came out. Household consumer confidence is dipping slightly, but that's because there is just so many geopolitical uncertainties at the moment. But as you said, fourth consecutive meeting in the row, rates held steady between 4.25 and 4.5%.
I guess we can call him thick-skinned Jerome Powell, you know, at this time. But we'll see if he doesn't bend to pressure, you know, going forward there with Trump wanting a cut, you know, at this point. But we did get data out of the UK. Inflation, that is about 3.4% last month. Is that good enough news for the Bank of England?
I don't think it's enough. No, I think, you know, it fell, as you quite rightly said, CPI from 3.5% in April. We've got the Monetary Policy Committee gathering at Threadneedle tomorrow, and I think we're going to see something similar to what we saw out of the US. I don't think Andrew Bailey, the central bank governor here, is going to shift again. I think, you know, outside of Nigeria, this Israel-Iran war is, topic, like front and center. And I think now, there's a shift in seeing exactly what happens next. Is there going to be a regime change? So at the moment, all domestic issues seem to be sidelined and everyone's focus is on the Middle East.
Right, so they're expected to get a decision from the Bank of England today. I guess the consensus, the hold at this point.
Yeah, that's right, a hold at 4.25%.
All right, definitely, we'll keep tracking that. Thank you so much, Juliana, for giving us the details there, what's happening in the UK. All right, let's get a check on other stories now. See in Malaysia, the communications regulator, they filed a civil lawsuit against Telegram and 2 channels there on the messaging platform for allegedly sharing content that breaks national laws. The Malaysian Communications and Multimedia Commission announced the legal action today, targeting both the messaging service itself and specific channels that allegedly distributed prohibited material. Then we see Brazil's central bank, they raised the benchmark Selic interest rate by 0.25 percentage points to 15%. And yes, the rate hike comes as inflation expectations for 2025 and 2026 collected by the Focus survey remain above the inflation target, standing at 5.2 and 4.5% respectively. Copom's inflation projections for 2026, which is currently the relevant horizon for monetary policy, stands at 3.6% in their reference scenario. All right, so there you have it. Waiting on the Bank of England at this time. Later on, we'll get the decision. It's expected to be a hold, at this point.
Yeah, I think Nigeria also follows, possibility of a cut, but I mean,
everyone's expecting a cut in Nigeria at this point, most analysts and experts, but who knows?
But inflation has dropped. I mean, so maybe it's going to be a cut.
Maybe.
Just maybe.
Maybe,
But how realistic is that? That's also another thing. But I'm sure the manufacturers will say, please, let's just get a cut and boost, production in the country. But don't forget, we're still waiting on our GDP.
Yeah,
so
GDP.
We don't know exactly the size of the country yet.
Q1. And we're already here where we are right
and we're
now.
at the end of June.
Yeah.
Wow. All right, Ladi, thank you.
Thank you.
And just before we let you go, we have to let you know that yesterday the market was on fire back here in Nigeria. Some gains that were so much. Seplat led the way. Then the Fugas, the banks, I think after the CBN made that clarification that banks are still in a good place. And then we've seen banks like Zenith also release, their statements of how reliable they are when it comes to, all of this that the CBN is talking about. We've seen investors' confidence. In fact, investors just went to the market yesterday, and we saw over ₦1 trillion added to the market cap. I mean, somewhere before the close of trade, we saw the all-share index hit 117 and then corrected a bit to 116. But that's going from 114 in one trading session, from 114 to 116. That was a whole lot. 1.63% added, equities 73.681 trillion. So it was a good market yesterday. We could expect it to continue today, but there's also, of course, the possibility of some investors trying to take some profits out of that. So, the essence of investing is for profits, right, at the end of the day. But it's a good market for Nigeria at this time. Perhaps you want to look that way. It might be a good one for you. Well, that's it on the program. Thank you so much for being a part of Business Morning. Business Incorporated is in a couple of hours. Ladi will be here, as well as Anite Ede, to take you around the world of business. I'm Ini John Mekwa. Have a good day.